I'm Chuck Curran of the Lafayette Historical Oral History Project, talking with Guy Atwood on May 19th, 2016. I'd like to start out by asking some basic questions, and then we can get into your involvement with the city and community. What is your full name and spelling?
Guy Davis Atwood. It's Guy, G-U-Y, Atwood, A-T-W-O-O-D.
And where were you, when and where were you born?
I was born in Turlock, California, in the Central Valley in March 1942.
And do you have any brothers or sisters?
I have an older brother. He's a PhD in, he's a clinical psychologist. And I have a younger sister who's a PhD in international communications, and she lives in Fresno, and he lives in Oklahoma City.
Oh, really? Okay.
I have a younger brother who passed away from cancer.
Okay. Why did you or your family choose to live in Lafayette?
I think the main reason was that my wife Diane actually lived in Lafayette as a child after the Second World War for 3 or 4 years with her family, and always had a little bit of an affinity for the community, even though she was very young at the time. And we were living in an apartment in El Cerrito at the time. Diane and I had met at Berkeley, gone to school together and married. And we're looking for a larger place for our 2 children. So, you know, Lafayette just seemed like a very nice community, and that's how we chose.
Okay. How long did you live in Lafayette?
We lived in, we moved into Lafayette in July of 1968, about 2 weeks after the city incorporated. In fact, I was told by someone that my daughter was the second child that was born in Lafayette after incorporation. It was my daughter Jeannie, and so we lived there up until 2015. So that's 47 and a half years until we just recently downsized to Pleasant Hill.
Wow. Where in Lafayette did you live, if you could give a street address?
We initially lived in almost like a summer home off of Deer Hill Road at 3384 Deer Hill. It was right next to Elizabeth Street, which used to go through, but the freeway obviously cut it off. And at that point in time when we moved in 1968, Deer Hill did not go through to the east. It did not go through all the way to Pleasant Hill Road. It actually stopped at Elizabeth. Either the county or city put it through in 1968.
What do you remember about Lafayette when you first came here? Like your house or your neighborhood or your transportation issues or schools? What do you remember about Lafayette when you first came here?
Well, it was certainly a lot of the surrounding area that we lived in was quite a bit of it was open space, very nice. We had Kay Tobias, I remember, was one of our neighbors down the hill, and we were the Montessori school. Did not exist at that time. It came in later. There were maybe 4 single-family homes there, where that was later developed by the Montessori school. But you basically had to drive everywhere from where we lived, you know, I remember the downtown. I used to get my clothes from Art and Jim Sherry, and it was later bought by George the tailor, and you know, the haircuts locally, that sort of thing.
Freddy's Pizza.
Yeah, Freddy's Pizza. We actually ate quite a bit, or I ate quite a bit at Flavio's, which was a little Italian place, I guess near the Seafood Grotto, I believe. I used to love, some of their sandwiches, and we didn't eat out an awful lot. A lot of our activities were around school activities. Our kids went at that time to Spring Hill School, and then later to, Stanley Middle School, and then on to Acalanes.
What kind of activities with the school would you go to or be involved with?
Mainly for me, it was Boy Scouts with my son.
Mm-hmm.
We did a lot of activities. We did some hikes up in the Sierras. My wife was pretty active with the schools. There used to be an annual fundraising, and she used to help make the confetti eggs
mm-hmm.
that they used to sell, and that's how we raised money. We had a little art fair. It later became a much bigger activity. I remember at one point they held the fundraising in the Shepherd's auto dealership, and
mm-hmm.
it was in their maintenance facility, and we had these tables set up underneath these great big lifts and so forth, and it became a big affair. They raised something like $60,000, and this was back in the 1970s, and it was a lot of money. And prior to that time, if we raised $5,000, we thought we were doing well. So
mm-hmm.
it turned into eventually a big affair.
Okay. Anything else? Traffic issues or going through the tunnel, coming out?
Most of the time I commuted to work, either in San Francisco. I started out as a CPA with a regional CPA firm, certified public accounting, and eventually went to work for a high-tech firm down the peninsula, and then ITEL Corporation in San Francisco, where I helped take a couple of their subsidiaries public. So most of the time I was commuting. I did have one time I worked for a company in Walnut Creek, and I loved that commute. It was so quick and fast. But most of the time I was commuting.
Mm-hmm. Well, that gets back to where you lived and what your neighbors were like.
Well, from 1968 to 1971, we lived on Deer Hill, and then with my birth of my daughter, as she started to grow up, we wanted a larger home, and we really wanted to be a little bit further away from the freeway because that became a little bit of a noise issue for us, and so we bought a home in Spring Hill Valley, just over the hill. As it turned out, one of my neighbors just 2 homes down was Don Black, the first mayor of Lafayette. Mm-hmm. And a fellow by the name of Alan Tebb invited me to join the board of directors of the Spring Hill Valley Homeowners Association, which I did in 1972, and that's when I became fairly active in what was going on in the city.
Uh-huh. Okay.
I will say that some of my mentors who helped teach me a lot about what was happening in Lafayette were people like Alan Tebb, Bill Chilcote, who was part of the committee to study incorporation for the city of Lafayette back in the 1960s, along with Ned Robinson and Don Black. Bill and I became quite close. Bob Wood from the Happy Valley area. Bob was also later, he co-founded the Lafayette Arts and Science Foundation. So those 3 people were very helpful to me early on in learning about the city.
Okay. In your work with the city and everything else, did you have time to do other things, or what did you do for fun?
Well, we bought some land up on the California coast at Sea Ranch and built a home up there, and we used to go up there quite often. Even before we built the home, we would take trips up there because we just loved the California coast and enjoyed it. It's about a 3-hour drive each way, so it was a long drive. But we were young at the time, and it didn't seem to bother us as much. But so we spent a lot of time there. We spent a lot of time with school activities for the kids. And most of the other things I did outside of the activities for Lafayette were with people I knew from work and things of that nature. We, a lot of outings and so forth with them.
Speaking of work, you had your friends, and then you had business associates. Were any of them your mentor, or you can?
I wouldn't say that they were mentors for this kind of purpose. I mean, I had certainly mentors for business purposes. I enjoyed most of my career was in accounting and finance. Once I left the accounting firm, then I became a controller for a company, and then eventually worked into becoming VP of finance for several companies. And after, in the mid-90s, actually in early 90s, mid-90s, I became the VP of finance for the California Alumni Association for a couple of years, which I enjoyed that immensely.
Is it University of California?
University of California at Berkeley, and working with Jim Burke, the director, I really enjoyed that experience. We were very successful in getting the Alumni Association in a much better financial position, and turned around and operating profitably and growing quite rapidly. And then I took another company public in 1997, another high-tech company, and was able to retire in 2000 from the success of that IPO for that company.
Okay. Who was the most important person in your life? Can you tell me a little bit about him or her?
Well, by far, it's most important in my life was my wife Diane, whom I met at Berkeley. We actually lived in the same apartment building, and she really changed my life significantly. She settled me down, I think, and who knows what would have happened to me if I hadn't met Diane. She's an amazing individual because she's a type of person who can fix anything and just about do anything and do it well. She used to design and make quilts, and she used to own a used bookstore called Hooked on Books in Walnut Creek. She built her own computer at one point. So anybody who knows Diane knows what I'm talking about. She was also active in the Friends of Lafayette Library Association, and she was president for one term. Oh. So she's always she's really been the rock.
Okay. Now, what are the biggest changes you've seen in Lafayette?
Well, I think the biggest changes have been in the downtown, and clearly they've been in larger, taller buildings and structures. Whether you agree or disagree with some of them, that's probably been the biggest change, and that has resulted, I think, in part of the increased traffic that we're traffic congestion that the community currently faces. Although a lot of that traffic is also coming from other cities that have to drive through Lafayette, like Moraga, for example. So I think that's probably been the single biggest thing.
Uh-huh. It's interesting. Can you think of anything else? Housing or office complexes or zoning issues?
Well, the city recently passed a. But let me back up. I was involved in the implementation of the zoning for the 1974 general plan. That came to the Planning Commission. I was on the Planning Commission from 1975 through 1981 in Lafayette, and chair twice. And we brought all the zoning in the city into conformance with the 1974 general plan, and that the city at that point had just taken over all the zoning from the county at the time of incorporation in 1968. So it took us several years to do that. And then I was involved with the general plan committee, the committee that wrote the general plan. I was chair of that committee for the current general plan, which was the 2002 general plan. And what the city did was they came up with a specific plan for the downtown, called the Downtown Specific Plan, and they've raised the height requirements from 35 feet to 45 feet in certain situations. And so I'm still concerned to this day, although we've only had one bad example of that so far. I'm still concerned that eventually we're going to see much taller buildings in the city, in downtown Lafayette. The one building that got approved is a 5-story building near BART that's currently under construction. That it's 5 stories on the south side, and once that's built, I think people are going to be somewhat shocked about that change. But that's, when you get taller buildings, then it's difficult to take care of the parking, and there's more traffic. And even though it may be near BART, people aren't going to take BART that much if they're used to driving. And so we're just going to see more and more traffic congestion and parking issues in the downtown.
Yeah. Well, this is where I wanted to go next, is that talk about your involvement in city planning, the homeowners council committees, etc. And so if you could want to go through and expand on each and what they meant to you and to the city, and their historical impact for future residences.
The way I got started in Lafayette politics was in 1969. The city had just put through Deer Hill Road all the way to Pleasant Hill Road, and a group in the city wanted to change the name of Deer Hill Road, and of course all the neighbors who lived on Deer Hill Road weren't too happy with that. So Kate Tobias, who was a neighbor, and a number of our neighbors got together, and we went down to the newly appointed, I think, Planning Commission of Lafayette in 1969, I believe. I think it was held in Lafayette School. I think the meeting was either at Stanley or Lafayette School. But and we made our pitch to retain the names Deer Hill Road, and the Planning Commission agreed with us. And so that's why Deer Hill Road still is called Deer Hill Road to this day. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, it would have been, Smith or Jones or something like that. Once I joined the Spring Hill Valley Association Board in '72, then that organization was very active in the city. 3 of the 5 initial city council people who were elected to city council were from the Spring Hill Valley. And including Don Black, who was, like I said, was a neighbor of mine. And we got involved in at that time, the only referendum in the history of the city of Lafayette. And the referendum was to oppose an approval by the city in conjunction with the developer of the Kaiser Estate at the corner of Pleasant Hill Road and Olympic. And we were able to get the signature signed. This was before computers and before a lot of the ways that people can use nowadays to communicate. And we held an election, and we got 72% of the vote
Wow. Okay.
to defeat that proposal. And as a result of that, I realized that the power in Lafayette was really at the city council and planning commission levels. And so I became involved with a number of the people who I worked with on the referendum. People like Harry Laughlin, I've mentioned Alan Tabb, Bob Wood, Bob Roach, who also became on the city council, was part of that group. Art Ronat, Bill Chilcote, who became a member of the city council from that group.
Okay.
Hollings Renton, who became CEO of one of the large healthcare firms. Norm Lustig and others, and we were the group that really handled that referendum. So I realized at that point that I need to get involved in getting good people elected to the city council. And so over the ensuing 40 years, I probably have served on, been the treasurer for, or the campaign manager for, I would say as many as 2/3 of all the city council people in the city of Lafayette. And as a result, I was appointed to the Planning Commission in 1976. And so I served on that for 5.5 years. And that was a lot of fun because there were a lot of buildings that came in for approval, and a couple of the large housing developments. At that point in time, most of the housing and development of Lafayette, particularly in the valleys, not in the ridgelines, but in the valleys, had all been done. I mean, there really wasn't too many large spaces left that were relatively flat that where you could build a large, residential development. But again, as a result of those efforts, in 1974 or 5, at the encouragement of people like Bill Chilcote and Bob Wood and Alan Tabb, I wrote a draft of both the Hillside Ordinance and the Open Space Ordinance for the city of Lafayette at my kitchen table. And it was later approved by the Planning Commission, which I was actually serving on at the time, and approved by the city council. And those two ordinances were in effect for about 25 years until the current ordinances were redone and updated. But even the current ordinances were based upon the draft that I wrote in 1974, 75. So that's one of the things I'm probably most proud about.
Well, what was your capacity on the Planning Commission?
Well, I was both a member and chair. I was a chair of the commission twice. And again, as I mentioned earlier, we incorporated all the, we had to take all the zoning for the city of Lafayette and do the entire zoning of the city for every parcel.
Wow.
To bring it in conformance with the 1974 general plan. And in order to do that, we virtually had to walk almost every single parcel in the city of Lafayette. And we would do that on weekends. We would go out and drive around, and of course we had carte blanche to go on anybody's property that we wanted to. I remember Lloyd Townley was chair for part of that period, and he would, at the end of the day, he would open up his trunk, and he'd always have a case of beer in the back, and we'd always have a beer or two. After a long, hot day of hiking over hills and valleys in Lafayette. But I certainly got to know the city
I can imagine.
and during that period of time. And
what would be your thinking when you started working on this general plan for what you felt would be a future, the meaningful, deal for the city?
Well, in terms of the 1974 general plan, I had already at that time drafted the Hillside and Open Space Ordinance documents, which were working their way through the city. So I certainly wanted to protect as many of the ridgelines and hillsides in Lafayette as much as I possibly could. And so that was always primary in any kind of zoning that we were looking at. And in fact, with almost every application that came in for a approval, housing application, we always, if there's a ridgeline involved, a major ridgeline in Lafayette, then we would require that ridgeline be protected. And set aside as open space, and as part of the approval process for the application. And then once it was finished, then we would that property would then be turned over to East Bay Regional Park District to manage. So almost all the major ridgelines in Lafayette are protected. The biggest battles today, I think, are over the remaining lots that are near those ridgelines. And but I think for the most part, we've been successful, very successful.
Yeah. When we last talked, you had mentioned there was something about your commute in San Francisco that helped you think that you didn't want necessarily that to happen in Lafayette. It was the Ticky, tacky houses.
Oh yes, there was a song. Little boxes or something like that, and it's a portion of housing in Daly City, I believe. And if you've ever seen it, driven by it, you'll know what I'm talking about. And I remember thinking, that could happen in Lafayette. We had the same kind of situation. We had ridge lines and hillsides and valleys and so forth. And for a number of reasons, I really didn't feel that was appropriate for the city of Lafayette, and that was, part of the driving force to try to do everything we possibly could to preserve those ridgelines and hillsides. And like I said, I think for the most part we've been very successful with that, over the years. There was I think it was a bond measure that Bill Chilcote had tried to get approved at the time of incorporation in 1968. He was a driving force behind that, and it was narrowly defeated. In those days, you only needed a 50% vote, and I think it got like 49%. But if it had passed, then the city probably would have had the money to buy a lot of open space in the city and protect it that way, but it didn't pass. And so we had to work at it in different ways to try to protect as much as we possibly could. And the ordinances were one way, and then requiring the granting of some of those ridge lines upon approval for some of the residential developments was the other way that we did it.
Okay. Any additional? Your involvement with the city is pretty extensive, so let's keep talking about.
Well, after I left the Planning Commission, I had felt, and a few others felt, that we pretty much had accomplished everything in the city, and we thought, well, we have a general plan, we have all ordinances in effect, and everything should just proceed fairly normally. And it only took about a year and a half to see some of the things that were being proposed to change the city in a significant way, particularly in the neighborhoods at that time. And so again, some of the concerned folks that I'd worked with, we came together and we started something called the Lafayette Homeowners Council. And I was a co-founder of that. And that was a kind of parent or umbrella group for all the individual homeowners associations in Lafayette. And it was a way of bringing the ability for, if there was a problem in a certain homeowners area, they could get help from other homeowners associations, either information about how the best way to proceed, or in some cases, we could help them try to work with the city to try to get a better development or get something changed. And that group is still in existence, been in existence since 1983. So 33 years, and has done a number of wonderful things over the years. And there's just been a number of wonderful people who have served on that board and become my friends and so forth. People like Lynn Hedane, Hiden, who's been on the Circulation Commission for forever, and Carol Singer, who's been on Parks and Rec. And if I start naming too many names, and then my list will take probably an hour, but they're just a lot of really super dedicated people who have helped to work in the community over the years to make Lafayette a better place to live.
Sure. Is there any one thing that helped you when you formulated this council? That, say, I live up in Burton Valley, in the St. Mary's Orchard area. Was there some other group that came to you and you solved their problem or helped them out with?
Well, there were a number. I mean, I remember one of the big ones early on was the group that lived off of was it Pine Lane and that area there was near Upper Happy Valley Road, the entrance to that. East Bay Mud had wanted to put in or enlarge their facilities there into a major facility. And in that particular area, we wanted to keep residential, and we wanted to keep it, fairly open space, which it is today. And so we had to take on East Bay Mud. And the city didn't want to do it initially, but we convinced them to do it, and then we provided a lot of the legal expertise, and we won in court, and we beat East Bay Mud, and that doesn't happen very often.
No, it doesn't.
But that was really through the efforts of the members of the Lafayette Homeowners Council.
Oh, wow.
Bill Ramage, Jim Todhunter were real active, and there are a few others. But that's just one example of where we came together and helped a local area of Lafayette to protect that area.
Okay. You talked about the general plan, help draft language for the redevelopment agency.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm not sure which came first, but I think in 1973, the city, every city in the state of California is required to update their general plan about every 20 years by the state of California. And so the 1974 general plan was coming due. So the city formed a committee of about 12 to 15 members of people throughout the community, and I was named chair of that committee. And we began to work on a general plan in 1993. It didn't get completed and approved until 2002, 9 years later. Wow. 3 of those years were because the city was not in a position to allocate the sufficient efforts and funds for an environmental impact report. So we really worked on it for about 6 years. Maybe 5 years, and then there was about a year going through the approval process and so forth. But it's the current approved general plan in the city of Lafayette today, and it'll be effective until 2022. So I suspect in about 5 years we're going to have to start forming another committee to update the current general plan. But again, that was a very gratifying experience because we basically wrote that general plan, and it was the map for the development of Lafayette. And so it was I think even though it was very difficult effort, we used to meet about every 2 weeks, and towards the end I think we were meeting like every week, it seemed like, to try to get it done. But again, a number of people served in that committee and just did a super job of coming up with a really document I think everybody could be proud of.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if this was important, but the city limits would border Moraga and Orinda. How did you get them to review your plan, or were they involved in any way, or was Lafayette kind of by themselves?
I think other agencies and communities adjacent had an opportunity to comment. I don't recall anything of any real significance in terms of difficulty. I think there's some similarities between Orinda and Lafayette, for example. We share a common border, as you know, for a good portion of the western part of Lafayette. our biggest problem, I think, has been with development in Moraga, because it has to drive through, city streets to get to the freeway. They're landlocked. Otherwise, they're landlocked, and they can go through Orinda, they can go through Lafayette. And so we've always been concerned about development in Moraga. Moraga hasn't been too concerned about development in Lafayette. And so, I don't recall any contentious issues, throughout that process.
You also served on the finance committee?
Yes. That period of my life was pretty busy around 1993, because the city had been incorporated as a no or low property tax city, and it got really hurt at the time of Prop 13. And the reason for that is that the city was already running as a no or low property tax city. In other words, we didn't get that much revenue from property taxes. And because people were so concerned about increases in property taxes, that was one of the major issues for incorporation in 1968. If the city hadn't done that and made that commitment to the voters, they wouldn't have voted incorporation in. But Prop 13 said that everybody has to pay the same amount, 1% of the assessed valuation plus any basic increases. I think they can increase it maybe 2% a year or something like that. So that made everybody equal in terms of what they paid. But what happened is the legislature said that, however, we're going to distribute the funds based upon the way they were distributed before Prop 13. So even though Lafayette was paying their property taxes, they weren't getting their property taxes back. Those monies went to other agencies and to the state and so forth, to the county. So there were about 25, 30 cities in the state of California who were in that position, and it took them about 15 years of working and to finally get the state legislature to give Lafayette some of its property tax monies back, which was, believe me, a big deal, because it's probably the single biggest item of revenue in the city's budget today, where it was almost zero 15, 20 years ago. So because of the problems that we were having in 1993, and this was before we could get the reallocation of those monies back, the city was looking for ways to either run the city more efficiently, cut expenses, raise revenues. So the finance committee was formed, and I wasn't an official member, but I started to go to all the meetings, and nobody else showed up other than from the public. So they finally adopted me as part of the committee, and there were 4 of us, and we basically, along with city staff, drafted 43 recommendations to help improve the way in which the city could either cut expenses, raise revenues, or operate more efficiently. And the city council adopted 42 out of those 43. Yeah. And we did some things like, we wanted the city to run more like a business. So we allowed the city to set aside some of their savings as an incentive that they could use the following year, or even in some cases maybe for bonuses and things of that nature. Mm-hmm. So that was a real incentive for the employees to work to save money and to do things more efficiently. And as a part result of that, and because of all these additional property tax revenues that were coming in that the city didn't have, the city today has the highest rating possible, credit rating, and is in very good financial shape. Out of that series of recommendations, we talked about forming a redevelopment agency for the city of Lafayette, and so I then became active in working with the city to get that process going, and worked with the attorney on the language for the redevelopment agency, and eventually, it was approved, and it was a redevelopment. The redevelopment agency is basically the downtown property owners, and So the additional tax revenues that came out of the base year, 1985 or whatever it was, everything over that amount could go into this fund for the redevelopment agency to help improve the downtown. And it was initially designed, most of the monies were designed to go back into the businesses to help them. They wanted to redo a storefront or a structure or other street improvements, whatever the case might be. Bob Adams, who was city manager, negotiated with the county the ability to use funds for public facilities as well, and those funds didn't count against what they called the cap of the property taxes in the agencies, and those funds then helped build the library and the new Veterans Hall. So in effect, the new library costs about $50 million to build and about another $50 to $70 million in interest. It cost over $100 million. About 80-90% of those funds came from the redevelopment agency. So I feel pretty good about the effort that I and others were able to put in on that, and which led to building these buildings. And but if you really want to think about it, it's really the downtown property owners who paid for these structures.
Right.
Through their property taxes then went for that purpose.
Did any of that? I'm trying to think about other standout things in the city now that people could look at that this originally helped out in.
Well, one of the big amounts of funds went to build the building. Can you stop that for a second?
Okay.
One of the major projects for redevelopment in the downtown, in addition to the new library and the Veterans Memorial Building, was the Steve Cortese's Mercantile Building. I think either $1 million or $2 million came out of the redevelopment agency funds to help build that project, make it financially feasible, which included some public parking underneath that building, and I think that's turned out to be a really nice structure in the downtown. So that's an example of how some of those redevelopment funds were used.
Okay. I know other cities become a little bloated and have long-term obligations to their employees. How did the city of Lafayette did a lot of outsourcing through this process?
Initially, again, because they were a no and low property tax city, most of the main services were outsourced. The fire department was already a separate agency, and continues that way to this day, although the city did look into and did a major study about trying to determine whether or not they should have their own fire department. But they concluded that they should stay with the county. Same thing for police services. Police services were outsourced to the county, and we have our own police chief, but he's really an employee of the county and reports to the city manager. But the city can add more police if they have sufficient budget to do that. So it's really a matter of how much they want to allocate to that. But I read once where the city of Lafayette was allocated like one police officer, and then we were able to get 2 or 3 when we incorporated. I think we're up to something like 17 now. And I have to say that the current police chief has just done an outstanding job, and I think that Lafayette does an outstanding job in controlling crime in a high-income city, which is a prime target, if you will,
Right.
of some people. And so those were outsourced. We used to outsource some of the contracted some of the maintenance and things of that nature. So Ernie Mariner was the very first city manager, and he didn't have a lot to work with, but Ernie did just an outstanding job of keeping the costs down and running the city on a very low basis. But as the city has become, I guess the way to put it is, as new people have moved into the city who expect more services, and as the city has had the ability to fund those services primarily through this increased property tax monies, which I think amount to like $3.5 million on a $12 million budget, and they were almost zero 20 years ago. We've been able to afford, more police and more services to provide for the residents.
Yeah. Well, especially with the high bond rating, that in turn gets, if you want to borrow money, a lower interest rate on things, which is a benefit to everybody in the city.
Right. We haven't had to borrow much money yet, but I think that that may change. And it's certainly nice to have that available. I think the other thing that during this period of time, up until about 1995, or actually about 2000, I've always been interested in trying to find a way to fix the roads in Lafayette, and I'm certainly not the only one. I worked on a campaign in 1995 that was successful. I remember, I think it was Bill Zion was one of the people, and Ann Groden, I think, and there were others who were very instrumental in getting that bond measure passed, and it's the only one that's passed. I mean, since that time, we've tried 3 others, and they've all failed, and the main reason is that they require a 2/3 vote. But fortunately, a few years back, with some twisting of arms, we were able to get the city council to put up $3 million out of their savings to accelerate road replacement in Lafayette. And today, the city's in a position within 5 years to have all their roads fixed and drains and brought up to a very high standard. And most likely at that point in time, we'll be in the best shape in terms of roads and drains of any city in Northern California.
That's great for the residents of Lafayette.
Yes.
In 1994, I'll bring up something about you. You were Citizen of the Year for Lafayette, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about that, or the dinner that they gave you. And I think there was a certain terminology they used for you.
Yes, that was really, I think, a reward for me for not just one thing, but maybe an accumulation of some of the things that we've talked about, or recognition, if you will. The Citizen of the Year is put on by the Chamber of Commerce in the city of Lafayette, and Don Tatson was the MC for that, and I think one of the council members, who was a chamber member, Jay Strauss, I think, made me a cap and named me Mr. Semi-Rural. Mm-hmm. So I had a cap that I used to wear around that said Mr. Semi-Rural. And a number of the people who got to know me at that point in time, they always thought of me, I think, as Mr. Semi-Rural for City of Lafayette, which I think goes back to both being involved in writing the initial Hillside and open space ordinances for Lafayette, but also in trying to retain that character throughout the city for many, many years.
So where do you see Lafayette going in the future, if you can expand on that.
I think it's going to be more of the same. I think there's going to be. I don't think there will be that much happening in the residential areas. I mean, the general plan and the ordinances have done a pretty good job. When I say ordinances, I include the Hillside and open space ordinances. Done a pretty good job in protecting the residential areas of Lafayette. The downtown, on the other hand, is going to see a lot of development potentially for more housing. The pressure is really coming through the state of California and and other agencies to try to provide more housing and more affordable housing in the state. And so the city, every 7 or 8 years, has to come up with a new housing element, and that housing element has to specify the number of homes or parcels that the city can provide through zoning to meet the requirements in this area, which is the ABAG area, which is the 9 counties around the Bay Area. And so City of Lafayette has allocated their share, and there's 4 categories. There's market housing, there's moderate affordable, there's low affordable, and there's very low affordable. Those are the 4 categories of housing, and the city has to be able to, they don't have to build it, but they have to provide the ability to have it built through zoning and other incentives. And so the city has worked very hard over the past number of years to try to do that, and they have an approved housing element that's for the next 6 or 7 years now.
Well, this is only we covered a partial part of your involvement in the city. I guess I could ask you, what would be your proudest? What are you proudest of in your life? That would be a lot of time and effort in making City of Lafayette great. But I don't want to put words in your mouth.
Well, outside of my family, which I'm very proud of, I think it's probably a number of things that have happened that I've been able to be involved in over 40 years of city government. But probably the single most thing I'm proud of are the Hillside and open space ordinances, because I think they've had the most dramatic impact on a long-term basis for the city of Lafayette. I don't want to give the impression that I was the only one involved in that process. There were certainly a number of other people who all deserve some credit. But that's the single thing I'm most proud of, because I wrote the original draft of those documents at my kitchen table in 1974, I believe. But some of the other things I think have been good too. I think working with this committee to do the general plan was very gratifying. Just a super group of people, dedicated residents. That's one of Lafayette's strengths, I think, over the years, has been the participation by individuals in the government process in some way. And I think if I had one worry or concern about the future of Lafayette, it's the fact that that process has been diminished. It seems to me like the committees and commissions accept a lot easier the recommendations of city staff. And it's not that they're not well intended, but they may not be what the community really wants. And when I served, we challenged every single thing that they did, every single recommendation, and we improved and made better every single thing that was done. And basically the community, ultimately what the community wanted is what the city did. Now that's not true so much anymore. The city seems to have less and the community seems to have less and less a voice in what's happening in the city, and that's disturbing to me, and I think that's been one of the biggest problems. But as I said, over the years, if you look back to the 1950s, 1960s, I think the involvement of the citizens in Lafayette have really been the big reason why Lafayette has become a great little community to live in.
Well, I can attest to your efforts and other people's efforts on especially the Ridgeline Ordinance. I moved away, lived in Seattle for 35 years, and moved back about 5 years ago, and the thing that stands out is those beautiful ridge lines with no houses on it and cattle grazing. So thank you.
You're welcome.
And thank you for this interview, and you've been a great help in supporting Lafayette, and so this will end the interview.